Welcome to Voices,
a podcast from the Institute for Human Rights and Business.
Here, we're seeking to elevate the range of perspectives
on the role of business in the world
and in people's everyday lives.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of IHRB's Voices podcast. I'm Guna Subramaniam for the IHRB's Migrant Workers Program in Southeast Asia. On this podcast, we are talking to Sumitha, Shaanthinni, Kishna. Sumitha is the director of Our Journey, an NGO platform in Malaysia for experts on migration issues to advocate government and private stakeholders to develop a supportive migration system with international standards and norms. Sumitha is also the current chair of the Migrant Forum in Asia, or MFA, a regional network with civil society membership in 18 countries from the Middle East and Asia, advocating for the protection of migrant workers. Sumitha serves in many national and international coalitions and networks for the protection and rights of migrant workers, but also refugees, asylum seekers, trafficked persons, as well as foreign nationals on death row. Sumitha is an advocate and solicitor with her own law firm. She also serves on the mediators panel of the Bar Council Malaysia Mediation Center. Sumitha, welcome to the Voices podcast. In Malaysia, there are at least 2 million migrant workers based on official work permits issued. Migrant workers are largely employed in agriculture, plantation, construction, and manufacturing sectors. The migrant worker population is diverse, made up of workers from Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, Vietnam, among many other countries. Civil society organizations such as Our Journey have been working tirelessly for many years, including during the pandemic, to advocate and provide assistance for migrant workers. Sumitha, before we talk about the organization Our Journey, please tell us a little bit about your journey. As a lawyer, what got you so involved so deeply in migrant worker issues?
Thank you, Guna, for having me on your podcast. Before I joined back practice in working as a lawyer, I worked with the Bar Council Secretariat from 2007 to 2018. And during my tenure there, I was assisting the Bar Council Migrants, Refugees and Immigration Affairs Committee. So this is how I got interested in that work. Migrant workers take a very brave step in leaving the comfort of their home, their village and their family to travel for the very first time. For many of them, they travel for the very first time to countries with different customs, culture, language, social structure, and the way of life. Just with the hope and dreams to earn a decent living for themselves and their families. So this is what actually intrigued me about the migrant community. And receiving countries wouldn't have the infrastructure or the development it enjoys if not for the migrant workers. So these are some of the reasons I wanted to advocate for the migrant workers, their rights and their protection.
Thank you, Sumitha, for sharing with us about your journey. Now, can you share with us about your organization, Our Journey, and the type of work it does to support migrant workers?
Our Journey is a registered civil society organization that provides legal representation for migrant workers and refugees in labor, immigration, and criminal cases. We do a lot of advocacy with the government of Malaysia as well as government in the regions on improving the lives of migrant workers in all aspects, housing, medical, labor. And due to the COVID pandemic, we have been providing humanitarian aid for the migrants under our Makan for Migrant program in the form of food, hygiene products, vaccination, milk and diapers for their children as well.
Let's talk about the pandemic and its impact on migrant workers. Low-waged and low-skilled migrant workers around the world have been among the most vulnerable as businesses cut their wages and jobs to cope with the pandemic's economic impact. The pandemic has exposed gaps in labor practices towards low-skilled migrant workers across Southeast Asia, particularly in Singapore, Thailand, and Malaysia. The pandemic has also exposed inequalities experienced by the region's millions of migrant workers. Many thousands of migrant workers have also lost their jobs. A year on, Sumitha, what has been the responses from governments and businesses in Malaysia?
So where migrant workers are concerned, the Malaysian government has taken a hard line by omitting employers of migrants from wage subsidies. The economic packages that the government had churned out does not feature any assistance to migrants or their employers. So another downside is the government's food basket were not extended to migrants. So during the first movement control order in 2021, there were several arrests and detention of undocumented migrants, which unfortunately led to an outbreak in detention centers. We are in another lockdown currently in Malaysia, and we are seeing again undocumented migrants being arrested and detained. Although we have a legalization program which is going to be running until 31st of December 2021. So I would say that the response of the government has not been really good in terms of migrant workers. But unfortunately, the businesses have not been able to do much, given that this is a new government. I wouldn't say new government in the sense that they're not persons who were not in government before, but it's a whole new government from the last one we had. So the businesses are not able to advocate with the government and put forth their concerns because the government offices are not operating. We're not able to have face-to-face meetings. So it's a bit difficult in that sense. So the responses, I would say, again, that it's been quite negative where migrant workers are concerned.
And what do you think businesses can do on their own?
I think what businesses can do is take responsibility of their workers, including those who are undocumented, providing them the food and basic necessities, because working hours have been reduced. There is no overtime allowed at this point of time. And so some sectors are also closed. So although the employers are required to still pay the minimum wage, but in reality for some employers, especially the small and medium-sized enterprises, this is very, very difficult because, the sector is closed and then you're not doing business. How do you still pay the migrant worker the minimum wage? But I think the least the businesses could do is ensure that the migrants are given food provisions and hygiene packs so they can sustain while the lockdown is in progress.
Through the pandemic, women migrant workers have been particularly impacted. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've seen through your work with Our Journey and MFA?
From our interaction with women migrants, in comparison to men, women have the additional burden of having to find a safer accommodation, a safer working environment, and also the lack of access to reproductive rights. As you know, there is a policy in Malaysia that does not allow women to become pregnant. But during the pandemic, when we were providing food aid for a lot of the migrants, we came across many single women, single mothers, without the presence of the children's fathers, where the women had to work, they had to find daycare for the child, they had to provide vaccination for their children, which is extremely expensive. All this with the minimum wage they were receiving. So we also found that women tend to omit doing overtime because they have to care for their children. So their children remain undocumented as well, and they face a bleak future because they have no access to any public schools, and private schools are extremely expensive. Many single mothers also choose to stay in Malaysia undocumented because of the fear of facing stigmatization in their home countries. What we have seen also is migrant workers in general are not favored for overtime because some companies feel it's an extra burden to have to provide transportation to pick up and drop off their women employees. And also male workers are also preferred because the employers don't have to deal with women taking leave or time off to deal with their menstruation problems. So these are some of the discriminatory mindset that women have to face in relation to their work.
The US State Department released its 2021 Trafficking in Persons Tip Report. Malaysia was downgraded to Tier 3 after 3 years on the Tier 2 watch list. The tip report states that Malaysia fell to Tier 3 this year as the government continued to conflate human trafficking and migrant smuggling crimes and did not adequately address or criminally pursue credible allegations from multiple sources alleging labor trafficking, including in the rubber manufacturing industry and palm oil sector, with the government owning 33% of the third largest palm oil company in the world. One recent phenomenon to note, the withhold release orders, WROs, stopping goods at the US borders. US Customs have clearly identified flawed recruitment practices as an identifier of forced labor and trafficking. And for instance, Top Glove in Malaysia was forced to repay large amounts of recruitment fees charged to workers late last year. And in March this year, the European Parliament voted in favor of binding European Union EU due diligence legislation, which applies to all companies operating in the EU market. This new law that requires companies to identify, report on, and address any human rights risks in their direct operations and supply chains, including those related to migrant workers. For Malaysian businesses, including SMEs, is there sufficient understanding of these issues and the risks affecting workers, including migrant workers, that can ultimately affect their businesses if they wish to supply to the US or the EU markets? And what can Malaysian companies do to prepare for, such as the upcoming mandatory EU legislation, if they want to supply to brands operating in the EU?
It is regrettable that the Malaysian was downgraded to tier 3 in the US TIP report, but this was expected because of the allegations of the government not tackling the human trafficking syndicates and also the corruption among the enforcement officials. But this is not the first time we have been downgraded. We have been downgraded before, and then we were upgraded to a tier 2 watch list, and then once we even went to the tier 2 list. But then I think the problem here is that the government is not very active in identifying victims of trafficking. It takes a very narrow interpretation of the law where they do not recognize mental coercion in the absence of physical restraint. So they require the victim of trafficking to be physically restrained. Only then case of trafficking can be filed. But I think that is the problem we have in Malaysia. Not all migrants are physically restrained. You can mentally coerce a victim of trafficking into staying in that abusive position with fear or with the threats to the migrant himself or to the family members. So I think this is where the government was not very proactive in trying to expand its definition of victim identification. Secondly, we have very, very few labor inspectors. Most of the time we see the labor department doing labor inspection based on complaints. But then if you do not complain, then they do not really go and do a labor inspection because they just don't have enough manpower. So what can businesses do? I think the buyers can do is to ensure that the businesses that are exporting to them adhere to the ILO, international norms on recruitment policies, and also ensure that their social audits go beyond the second and the third tier. Because from what I understand, buyers are only able to identify their suppliers in the first, second, and third supply chain. Beyond that, they actually do not know who is providing the products. So I think that is also a problem. And we see most of the cases are from the supply chain, the end part of the supply chain. So it may be a small SME providing a nut or bolt to a much bigger company, and a lot of the exploitation happens in the small SMEs. And also expanding your social audit to not only the company itself, but to the service providers to the companies. Example, in Malaysia, you have security companies providing security services to a large multinational company. But then when the social audit is done, the social audit is only confined to the company, but not taking into account what are the labor rights of the security guards because they are outside the payroll of the company. So, but then we see a lot of security guards facing a lot of labor violations, a lot of long hours, reductions of their overtime. So maybe as a company, that is something they need to expand, their social audit. And perhaps also engage the civil society, the trade unions in the country of destination before they do the social audit. So when they do the social audit, they will be able to identify more issues in the company or ask the right questions to bring out the real issues in the company. Of course, when a social audit is done, the company does not tell everything that is happening. And even if you interview the workers, sometimes they are not able to express themselves because most of the workers don't understand that they are in a forced labor situation or what the employer is doing is right or wrong. So it will be good if they can engage the trade union and the society to assist them when it comes to social auditing. So these are some things I think the buyers can implement and also the companies can take on board. Of course, during the pandemic, the problem of the pandemic is a lot of the companies are suffering, and we do understand that a lot of companies are downsizing and all that. But one of the issues that there are companies that need workers. So if there are companies that are letting go workers, they can provide those workers to the company that is seeking workers and give their consent for the worker to move employment. So these are some things that I think the companies can take on board, apart from, of course, ensuring that they adhere to the labor laws and the international norms on labor rights as well.
So when workers are recruited ethically, both the employer and worker benefit. So what can Malaysian companies do to prevent unethical recruitment of migrant workers from occurring in their operations, even if they did not receive any support from their buyers?
Unethical recruitment practices always begins in the country of origin. So we always tell the employer that they have to do a due diligence on the agent that they are contracting with. Most of the time, what the employers will do is to just contract it with agent in the country of origin and allow the agent to do as they please. So this is where we find a lot of the agents either falsifying documents of migrants on age, example, or they would falsify the medical of the worker, and when the worker comes into Malaysia and does another medical test, he fails it. Or we also see a lot of the agents taking the recruitment fees, additional recruitment fees from the migrant workers. And you will see that when you speak to the migrant workers, the agents will tell the migrant workers not to reveal this information to the employers. There are some employers I know that have policies where they do not allow the recruiter to charge the workers a fee, but then the agents will go ahead and do that still. So I think it's important for employers to be more involved in the recruitment process, not to rely so much on the agent. And one other thing is to understand how migrant workers are approached to be recruited. It's not a matter of migrant workers coming to themselves. What entices the migrant worker to take on the job or to give the passport to the agent to be recruited? We have seen flyers that are produced in the country of origin where it says that the worker will be paid a certain amount as a salary, but when in reality that amount is way above the minimum wage that is being provided in Malaysia. Or they will be provided food, they'll be provided accommodation, a private accommodation. All that does not happen in Malaysia. So the migrant is enticed by these kind of false claims, and then they get recruited. So it is important that the employer either does, if he's able to, does a round of interviews with the migrant after they've been selected, so that the migrant knows the reality of the situation in Malaysia, and also ensure if they find that there has been some misrepresentation to the worker, then the employer must ensure that he does not take on this agent anymore. Terminate the contract with the agent, because the fact that to address unethical recruitment lies majorly in the hands of the employer. You can have the government having laws or licenses to ensure that the recruiter is registered. But we see that a lot of the recruiters, they have a main office, but then the persons who go out onto the field to recruit workers are the sub-agents, because the main agent is unable to employ many employees to do the job. So they will get people who are not part of their organization to recruit workers. So then again, we have an issue of who is that sub-agent answerable to. So ultimately, it has to be the agent who is seeking the assistance or seeking the services of the sub-agent. So having said that, it is the employer, again, who should play an active role to ensure that the agent that you are contracting with is licensed, has a good track record, do your due diligence. And if you find that there has been instances where the recruiter has taken money once the worker comes to your company, you should sit down and do an interview with your workers to find out how the recruitment process was done. Is all the documents in order? The age factor, or was this the job that they were seeking? And also the fact that whether they paid any monies to the recruitment agent. There was a company that did this kind of interviews prior to the workers coming to Malaysia and was able to pay back all the recruitment costs that the workers paid to the agent. So the company made the agent pay back all the recruitment money that he took from the workers, because the company had a policy that you could not charge the workers. It is really up to the employer to take an active role. And this, I think, is something that the employer can do, because you have the means. If you're going to bring someone to your company, you are also spending a lot of money. You are paying a lot of money to the government under the requirements of the laws of how much recruitment fees that you need to pay, the work permits that you need to pay. It's a lot of money. So you yourselves are spending so much on recruiting a worker. So it shouldn't be a case where you just bring any worker, and then when the worker is unhappy or you find that the worker is not the right person, you are forcing the worker to pay the cost that you have spent recruiting the worker. That should not be the case. You did not contract with the worker to be recruited, but you contracted with the agent to be recruited. And this is why we have been trying to push the companies to look away from the worker and look towards the agent, because that is the person that has created a lot of this unhappiness in the employer-employee relationship.
As part of IHRB's work with the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, in 2019, we held a roundtable on responsible recruitment in Kuala Lumpur. At the roundtable, there were assurances from the government on improving the recruitment processes and fees of migrant workers. Since then, there has been a change in government in Malaysia, and the pandemic has also presented challenges in following up from the last roundtable. Do you think events such as the leadership groups, roundtables, and stakeholder meetings with business, civil society, and governments are effective? And what more can be done to effect or inspire change with the various stakeholders?
The roundtable is a very positive move, and definitely it was welcomed. The issues that we discussed at the roundtable were very pertinent, and it also brought about a lot of the good practices that some governments were doing and what could have been done better. Of course, like what you mentioned, the Malaysian government has changed and there has been a bit of delay in a lot of policies and the good practices that we wanted to do in Malaysia. So having said that, I think now it's a good time for buyers and also maybe IHRB to speak to sending country governments to relook at memorandum of understandings that they have signed with Malaysia, for example, and also bilateral agreements to see how, because the pandemic has changed a lot of things. So they need to try to incorporate the effects of the pandemic into these MOUs. So it cannot be business as usual. So we have definitely a decreased number of intake for migrants. There are more restrictions for migrants to come in. Example, the COVID test. The cost of recruitment is going to go up because then have a quarantine test, quarantine cost. There'll be a vaccination cost. There's going to be also the medical test that they have to do prior to coming into Malaysia and also being here as well. So we foresee there's going to be an increase in recruitment cost. So how are we going to manage the increase in recruitment cost on a recruitment cost that is already high? We always say it is the role of the employers to allow the migrants to bear the cost of the recruitment. But we know that a lot of the workers ultimately take on this cost. So having said that, what can the countries do? Do we see a necessity that the sending countries ensure that their workers going abroad are vaccinated with a vaccination that is recognized in the country of destination? That is extremely important as well. And also do a follow-up booster shot in the country of destination, a cost that the governments of sending countries could take on. Or how do you ensure that your migrants coming in are placed in quarantine if need be, and who is going to be managing that cost? So do you have a game plan with the destination country on whether they're going to have a specific cost or a set cost for migrants who are coming in and a set cost that the employer will have to pay? So these are things we have not been discussed. And also in terms of pay, if there is situation where the country of destinations are reducing the wages. So what can the sending country do about that? Because we understand that, example, one of the Middle Eastern country had reduced the wage and the Indian government had agreed to it. But then the migrants were very upset and the civil society was very upset that the Indian government had accepted that reduced wage. So what can be done? How can we ensure that the wage is still according to the minimum wage of the country, or it is according to the market rate and things like that without affecting the migrant? So these are things I think we have not been addressed because of the pandemic. And perhaps these are things that IHRB as an organization can take on and have a discussion with the buyers and also with the sending country governments, and to see how they could maneuver this, because these are issues that have been brought up since last year when the migrant workers were trying to return back to their country of destination and were not able to, and found that there was increased cost of recruitment. I think it is an issue that we have not been able to tackle yet because there's not been enough discussion. And I feel that the country of destination and the country of origin should have a discussion on the cost as well, because we do not want a situation where the migrant is coming to the country of destination and having to be quarantined and bearing a whole lot of cost even before he starts work.
Do you think there is a new area for collaboration between business and civil society organizations where such work can have more significant, sustainable impact? Can labor rights advocates enlist the support of corporations to stop abusive practices? And can you see the advocacy landscape changing where generalizations about human rights groups as adversarial organizations and corporations as only profit-driven no longer hold? How can the two sides find ways to work together?
It's important for businesses and civil society to work together. But of course, the problem is there's distrust among both parties. Always the businesses will say that civil society is out to condemn the businesses, and the civil society will always say that the businesses are only out to make profit. But then it is important, I think, for both parties to come together to understand their individual roles. I would give an example of my own organization that works with businesses, and we have been working with two very good employers who had some issues within their employment with the migrant workers. But we were able to sit down and speak to the persons in charge, the HR as well as the bosses, to see how they could improve, to understand the restrictions they had in trying to provide a better working environment for their workers. And we were able to formulate some policies for the companies to say that, why don't you try this? Why don't you make some changes in your policy to ensure that the workers' accommodation is better provided, or try to have some benefits for your workers who were working with you for a very long time. So some discussions like that, because I wouldn't say that all businesses are bad. There are some businesses that are quite good and they look after their workers very well. And there are businesses that are actually quite clueless on how to manage their migrant workers. And what they do is they just look at the businesses next to them and see, oh, this is how you manage them and I will manage them the same. And it may be the wrong way of managing the workers as well. So it is important that for civil society, you need to be able to sit in the same table with the businesses and discuss issues. We always try to talk to buyers. We always try to talk to governments to rein in the employers, to have stricter conditions or to have stricter laws, enforce the laws and all that. But we also need to understand what businesses are doing and what are their restrictions. And on top of that, we must also understand the preference of the workers. So I think it is our duty. As civil society, it is not about just naming and shaming the companies or bashing the government, but it's also our ability to have the skills to talk with the employers and the businesses at the same table. I think a lot of issues can be resolved if parties talk together and resolve it internally, rather than putting it out in the newspapers, for example. Of course, there are some companies that have serious violations, trafficking instances and all that. And I understand when civil society wants to take greater actions against those businesses, and then they get the authorities involved, so which is actually okay. But by and large, I think we should be able to sit at the same table with the businesses and talk to them. And I think that is what this platform on roundtables and stakeholders that IHRB has done, has given us that opportunity as well.
So how do you think civil society organizations such as Our Journey and the Migrant Forum in Asia can play a collaborative role with businesses and global brands for responsible recruitment and positive labor migration?
One of the ways I think businesses could collaborate with us is to share with us their recruitment policies. And we could sit down together and see whether the policies are realistic, whether realistic in the sense that whether it conforms with the labor laws in the country of destination, and whether the businesses understand the labor laws in the country of destination. I think that is extremely important for businesses to understand the labor laws. Example, if you ask a lot of the companies here in Malaysia, they do not know what is contained in the Employment Act, or they do not know what is contained in the Trade Union Act, because they see every other company not allowing their workers to join the union. So they themselves don't allow the worker to join the union, even though the law allows it. I think for businesses to share what are their recruitment policies, and for CSOs to give their input into how to strengthen their position or how to have a better policy and also for them to understand the culture of the migrant worker in that country, or how he is recruited and what he goes through the recruitment process. I think that is something that businesses and global brands can take away from civil society like MFA. And we have a lot of knowledge on the recruitment drive that is taking place in the country of origin. And we also have knowledge about the labor laws in the country of destination. So this is something I think the civil society, such as my organization and MFA, can help the businesses and the global brands to understand. Because sometimes the government will announce some policy, but then the businesses or the global brands might not be able to fathom whether that is a realistic policy or whether that is a policy that is reflecting that something that's happening on the ground. So civil society could help to clarify whether that policy can work and how it can work better in the country of destination or even in the country of origin. So I think that's where the MFA's members' expertise lies, and that's where I think they can tap those kind of expertise to the benefit of the businesses and global brands.
Sumitha, this has been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your time on this podcast. And thank you to all our listeners. You can read more about MFA's call for an urgent justice mechanism for repatriated migrant workers at mfasia.org. Thank you.